So you just got a new camera and you want to make professional looking video. There's an easy way to do this, but it's all in the settings of your camera, and if you don't know what the settings are, it's probably not going to look very good. Let's get into it. I'm not going to get into the technical of all of these, but I'm just going to tell you what you need to know. So essentially what shutter speed does is it can make your footage either look sped up, slowed down, or it can make it look natural. What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to make your shutter speed about twice of what your frame rate is. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you'd want to put the shutter speed at 48. Most likely you'll just have to round up to 50. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, then obviously you'd go up to 120 or whatever's around that. If you make your shutter speed less than double what the frame rate is, it's going to look like slowed down a little bit. It's kind of going to look like a scene out of Lord of the Rings. So to get the most natural looking video, what you'd want to do is just double it. Of course, there's nothing wrong with going above or below, it is a stylistic choice. Second thing we'll talk about is aperture. Now there's not really a wrong way to do aperture. What it does is essentially the lower the number, the blurrier the background. Okay, simple enough. It'll also make it brighter the lower the number, and it'll make it darker the higher the number. Last thing we'll talk about is ISO, and really all this does is it just affects the brightness. Whereas the other things affected the brightness, but primarily they did something to the footage, this really doesn't. However, the higher that you push the ISO, the worse the quality of the image is. So if you use something like 100 or 200, it'll look very crisp and clean and there won't be a whole lot of noise. However, if you use something like, I don't know, 6400, 8000, something like that, it'll probably look pretty grainy. And then the minor settings. One thing that's really important, and I feel like most people understand, is resolution. If you're shooting in 720p, that is a much lower resolution and you'll get less detail than shooting in 1080p or 4K or higher than 4K if you have a professional RED camera and $60,000 of disposable income. My assumption is that you don't. Next, we'll talk about frame rate, and this is something that a lot of people actually get wrong. Frame rate tends to go 24, 30, 60, and then 120 plus. 24 frames per second is what a natural looking film will look like. Just about every single movie ever has been made in 24 frames per second. Using 30 frames per second, I do not ever recommend. I would say actually never even touch 30 frames per second. I think it looks horrible. Have you ever seen a soap opera and it looks just kind of off? You're like, this could look nice, the quality could be good, but there's something wrong with it. That's because they're shooting in 30 frames per second.
You never see my fight with temptation behind my smile.
A lot of people think that 60 frames per second is a higher quality than 24 frames per second. This is not true. And the only reason you would do this is, one, if you want it to look a little bit smoother, the footage will look a bit smoother and it'll actually look a little bit sped up, kind of like if we mess with the shutter speed. And then another thing that it does is later on, if you slow 60 frames per second footage down to 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, you'll get a nice smoother slow-mo. If you slow down 24 frames per second to say half the speed, it'll look very slow and laggy and gross because you don't have that extra information. Now there are other things like white balance, which essentially means do skin tones look like skin tones, or do they look blue, or do they look yellow? That's all that adjusts. Depending on the lights, it'll change it. And that's pretty much all that there is to talk about. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I hope you found this helpful. I love talking about this stuff, so feel free to email or comment to me. I love talking about this sort of thing. So thanks a ton. Have a good one.